I'm Charlie Bryan of Gold Derby, and today I'm speaking with Josh Margolin, the writer and director of the comedy action movie Thelma. Um, First question I want to ask you is, was the character of Thelma and the situation she finds herself in the movie, is that inspired by anybody from real life?
It is, yes. The movie is inspired by my real life grandma, Thelma. I kept the name. And the inciting incident, the scam call she gets where someone's saying, pretending to be her grandson, saying they were in an accident and need to be bailed out of jail. That's all based on a real event, too. A call that my grandma got when she was living alone in her 90s, and somebody was pretending to be me, pretty much almost verbatim what's in the movie, basically saying you need to send, 10 grand for my bail. And she got very panicked. My family got very panicked. And luckily, in real life, they were able to get a hold of me before the money exchanged hands. But it was a close call. It was sort of a buzzer beater moment. And so that incident and seeing her kind of duped and taken advantage of in that way was the seed of the idea that then got me thinking, okay, well, what if she did send it? And what if she set out on her own to get it back, which is something I would not put past her. So it's the character and the incident are all true. And then some of the narrative from there is imagined as sort of a way to, express a feeling.
In writing the script, what I love about this is that this movie kind of fits into one of my favorite genres, which is the action comedy. And I love films that can do that. Um, I always think of like one of my absolute favorites is Hot Fuzz.
Oh
Uh,
yeah,
I think that one.
amazing movie.
Yeah, I've seen that movie like 10 times and I could still
So
watch it. It's so great. Were there any films that particularly blended action and comedy that were sources of inspiration for this movie?
that's a great question. It's interesting because in a funny way, it's like I almost thought about it more through the lens of action tropes in sort of a traditional way because the content already was cutting against that. Like in a way, the fact that it was sort of half personal dramedy about my grandma and my relationship to her and aging and anxiety and autonomy and all these themes that were very personal to me and very very born of a real dynamic and a real story. To me, in a way, the alchemy became taking stuff that was really personal, taking stuff that felt really real to me, and kind of channeling that through the lens of an action movie and finding the kind of the contrast and the comedy in that, as opposed to necessarily like finding the sort of comedic action tone unto itself, if that makes sense. So much of it was built around how do we take those tropes? How do we take these things that you see in the Mission Impossible movies, in big action tent poles and use them in a kind of shrunken down way to explore like the everyday heroism of just moving through the world and being with this woman as she, traverses the dangerous streets of LA, on foot and on scooter. So to me, the comedy was always kind of born of the contrast and sometimes just the fact that we're going along for the ride with her, going like, oh my God, like what is she doing? I like to say that Tom Cruise jumping out of an airplane is obviously thrilling and terrifying, but so is watching my grandma get onto a bed, which I've witnessed many times when the bed is too high. And at least for me, that's equally tense. And so that became kind of the North Star, like finding a way to dramatize that moment in life, that mission to cling on to autonomy and to make sure we're never doing it by like cutting wide and revealing, oh, look how small this actually is, or poking fun or punching down, but being along for the ride with her. And then in that also finding fun and excitement and tension.
Yeah, did you find that it was kind of challenging to ride that line of like of incorporating comedic elements into it, but having it not go like full like slapstick, like a Hot Fuzz or something like that?
Totally. And it's like, yeah, to each movie its own and in terms of what tone it sort of requires to express the thought or the feeling. And I think for this one, the tone was always really sensitive because it's so easy to skew broad, especially with like an older woman with a gun. It's like Granny with a gun can easily skew very, very broad and silly as sort of a, if you look at that with soft focus. And what excited me about this and part of why I was so passionate about making it was because I really wanted it not to be that. I really wanted it to be tonally kind of towing the line between like a genuine, little action movie of sorts, a revenge movie in a way, and also sort of this, family dramedy about things that were on my mind. So to me, the stakes were always really important. And if you tip to referential or tip to parody, or even if the score gets too big, or if the camera moves get too sort of flashy, that it just threatens to kind of zap the stakes of it. And I think for me, part of the tone and the way of thinking about it was always like, if we start from reality and we start small, every time we ratchet up, it has to be incremental. We can never kind of go, from this movie to that movie. It needs to be like, oh, we're moving, and then suddenly we're kind of finding ourselves in a bit of a a low grade thriller of sorts. And so that to me was what excited me about it. And to your point, was the challenge of it, was always trying to toe that line and make sure we never felt like we were tipping. And I think that was like at every stage, script, production, and especially in the edit and with the score, which Nick Chuba, who did our score, did an amazing job and worked really hard on it, because it was always a balancing act of when it felt too big versus when it felt like it wasn't propulsive enough. And it was just, how do we, thread that needle?
Um, uh, I think the other like main question, you probably get asked this a lot about this movie, is was there ever any question in your mind that someone other than June Squibb could play this part?
Not really. I from the get, I was like, I'd imagined June from the start, just because she's someone who I've always loved as an actor. And every time she pops up, I'm always like, I wish I got to see more of her, because she's just so fantastic. And to me, she also, on top of just being a great actor, felt in my mind, and it turned out to be the case, which was fortunate, felt very connected to the character of like someone who just has that toughness and that grit and that tenacity, but also is funny and sort of without trying to be, and yet can also play these kind of soft moments and have this introspection and this subtlety. And I mean, she makes it look easy, I think, toggling between all those different modes, but it's definitely not. And it's something that I see in my own grandma, and I tried to bring into the character, was someone who's kind of, they can be single-minded, they can be hard driving in certain ways and stubborn, but also somehow even in their 90s. My grandma's 104 and still with us, fortunately, and she still manages to kind of like marvel at things, which was something that was always very always aspirational to me, to be in your 80s, your 90s, and sort of still marveling at things in the world as if they are new, or as if they are still like, mysteries to be pondered. And June, just to me, was like, she could play all those notes. And I couldn't think of anybody who was her age who felt like the character to me the way that she did. So thank God she said yes, because to me, it was kind of June or bust. If it hadn't been her, we did not really have a solid backup plan. We were like, we're just going to roll the dice here. And luckily she jumped on board.
I'm curious, what was the first thing you remember seeing her in where she stood out to you?
I think Nebraska is probably the first time I really was like, I think I'd seen her before in little roles, and I always liked her. But I think when I saw her in Nebraska, and I was like, oh my God, she's amazing. And then I think I even rewatched some of the older ones, and then started like, every time she would pop up, I would just be like, oh my God, there she is. And she's always great. And she always knows what movie she's in. Like she's an actor who can just toggle between those things again really seamlessly, and always, always knows how to kind of dial into the tone of the thing really, really well.
I think one of the other key bits of casting was finding the right person to play Danny. And Fred Heckinger really nails the intricacies of that character. A character you might not think there are intricacies for, but they are there. And I'm curious, what was the process like of trying to of finding the right person in order to play Danny and finding Fred Heckinger?
I'm glad you asked that, because that actually was kind of a pivotal moment in our process where June had jumped on board. We had her in there, which was amazing. And then, so Danny was originally written, at kind of like hovering around 30. It was like a slightly older character at a different inflection point, at a different kind of transitional moment, kind of, a little burnt out, trying to figure out what's next. And we were going out to some people and we were getting, good reads, but nothing was clicking. People weren't jumping on it. And I was like, we were feeling like something was feeling a little off. And then we saw Fred on White Lotus. And basically me and my producers, Zoe Worth and Chris Kay, were like, this is the guy. Like it's Fred is, I just felt kind of a kindredness with him, even just from watching him on screen. And he was so good on that show and so funny and so nuanced and just great that I ended up doing a rewrite on the script and aging the character down for Fred because, and at first I was reticent. I was like, oh, I don't know if it'll work as well. I'm grateful for so many reasons that I did, Fred being the biggest, but also I think just on a movie level, the parallels felt so much stronger between Danny and Thelma when he is at that moment, at that kind of like early 20s, floundering, trying to kind of, land somewhere. It's something about those transitional moments just echoed each other more soundly, I think. And then Fred is another one of those like unique, wonderful actors who just can bring so much subtlety to something, so much sensitivity, so much like presence and connectivity. He was another one where I was so glad that when we did age it down and do that pass kind of with him in mind, he sparked to it and he was our second piece of the puzzle on board. So Fred was a really important piece for many reasons, including kind of reshaping something pretty fundamental about the movie because he just had kind of that quality you're talking about. He can draw a lot out of something because he's so present and he's so thoughtful about, the way he approaches a project.
And well, if we're going to talk about other pieces of the puzzle, I think a third one would definitely be Richard Roundtree as what was it Ben was his name?
Ben, yeah, exactly.
Just so just so wonderful in this movie also. What was the process of of casting him and how did his name come about and what was that process like?
Yeah, there was sort of a couple of people we were looking at for Ben, and Richard was one of our top choices for the part. And it's funny too because I'd long been a fan of him, obviously from Shaft, and had kind of had that iconic character lodged in my mind. And I was like, well, I love Richard. I was like, this is definitely a different kind of part. I wonder, like, I was be so curious to imagine him in this role. And I got on Zoom with him, and I would say 30 seconds into that Zoom, it felt really clear that it had to be Richard. He was so warm and kind and funny and obviously still incredibly cool. But he just had this sort of sweetness to him that I was very charmed by and I just felt very connected to him very quickly. And I could feel, I think he really wanted to do something different. He really wanted to get to play kind of a softer side of himself, a role kind of embracing where he was at in that moment in life and being able to bring some of that vulnerability and that like fragility into it. And so I think I felt that from him in our conversation. And he felt like he just had something he needed to say and that he wanted to do and that this role was speaking to him for some reason or another. And and basically once I got off that Zoom with him, we all talked and we're like, I think we need to, let's try to lock in Richard because he just had that quality. And it was a quality that, he just doesn't get to play as often or hadn't gotten to play as often. And in working with him, it felt, not like any of these characters are exactly him, but that warmth and that kindness and that, lovely vibe and spirit, what was him. And I think we all just felt really lucky to have gotten to work with the guy and spend time with him. And yeah, he was just a lovely, lovely guy and a really wonderful actor.
Did it take on a bit more of a different tone after because he passed away soon after this filming wrapped, right?
Yeah, he passed away about a year later. And it was surprising to us because we didn't know he was ill, and we'd seen him for ADR, and he seemed really good, and he seemed excited, and then when we heard maybe about a week before he passed that he wasn't doing well, and luckily it was very sweet. We found out he got to watch the movie before he passed, and that he was really enjoyed it, which was sweet, but yeah, it definitely, it all feels a little bit more loaded. It all feels a little bit sadder in some ways, especially his character kind of, reckoning with age and reckoning with where he's at in life and the limitations. the frustrations. But you know, he put a lot of heart into the performance, and so I think that still just really shines through, and that, you know, vulnerability and sensitivity that he brought to it, I think is really, you know, it's a nice reminder of him whenever I see it again. It just is, you know, it brings me back to the feeling of working with him, and that kind of warmth and that kindness that he had, which I think really comes through.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for talking with us. We wish you all the best over this upcoming award season. And to all of our viewers, please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to stick with goldderby.com as Oscar season approaches. Thanks so much, Josh.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.